700 years ago, a young Venetian embarked on a 24-year odyssey, taking him to the furthest reaches of the globe. His book, Description of the World, altered the course of history and made him a legend. Some believe it also made him a liar. I'm Mike Yamashita, a National Geographic photographer. For centuries, Marco Polo has been a figure of inspiration and suspicion. Did the world's greatest overland explorer really see what he described in his fantastical book? Did he ever make it to China?
Great princes, emperors and kings, dukes and marquises, counts, knights and burgesses, and people of all degrees who desire to get knowledge of the various races of mankind, take this book and cause it to be read to you. For let me tell you that never hath there been any man who in his own person hath had so much knowledge and experience of the diverse parts of the world and its wonders as hath had this Messer Marco.
Those are the opening lines to Marco's modestly titled book, Description of the World. Now, when I first read it, I got what's called Marco Polo fever. And the symptoms of this disease are that I became obsessed, totally obsessed, with everything Marco wrote or talked about. And that's why I'm here in Venice. Okay, this is Corte del Milion, Marco Polo's believed to be his house. Why Milion? Well, he was called Milion by his contemporaries, and nobody knows really why, whether it was about the fact that he made $1 million or told 1 million lies, who knows? You know, Giuseppe, I've heard a lot of different stories about Corte del Milion, but tell me what you know about this building. Is this Marco Polo's house?
Yeah, not only this one. All was the house of Marco Polo, because the house was very, very large.
Do you know anything about Marco Polo?
Marco Polo?
Yeah. He lives there? What about this house?
No.
No?
No. The house of the art. The house of Marco Polo.
Does he live here?
No, Veneziano Doc. Dell'isola della Giudecca.
Oh, he lives on Giudecca. Nobody seems to know the answer. I think it's this one. Well, there is one clue that possibly says something about Marco Polo living here, and that is these two birds up there, which are, I'm told, the Polo crest, the Marco Polo family crest. What we do know is that Marco was only 17 when his father and uncle took him on one of the most influential journeys ever made. They were merchants, and Venice in the 13th century was the bustling commercial center of the Mediterranean. Yet very few Europeans dared venture beyond their borders. Back then, many people still thought the world was flat. No European, barring a handful of missionaries, would have gone as far as he did. Here we are at the Piazza San Marco with its 2 columns on the quay. This would have been the exact same view Marco saw when he left Venice for China at the age of 17. You see the size of that thing? Oh, man. I wanted to find a new way to shoot this historical place, and I discovered that one of the world's largest cruise ships the Grand Princess, was about to enter Venice.
Whew! Unbelievable. As a Japanese American, I grew up interested in the Far East. I studied Asian history in college, and now I'm going to get the chance to see a lot of that history come alive. Well, I've always been interested in Marco Polo, but what really got me and deepened my intrigue was reading an article questioning whether he actually made it to China or not. And I thought, wouldn't this be the opportunity to prove once and for all that he made it or didn't make the trip? That is the question.
I then read a book by Dr. Francis Wood, curator of the Chinese collection at the British Library, who argues that Marco fabricated the stories in his book.
For centuries, people have doubted whether he actually traveled all the way across Asia to China, whether he actually came back and wrote a book about it. Some people even doubt whether he even existed at all.
I'm going to retrace his steps, using his book like a guide, and make up my own mind. So whether you become a believer or not, what you're about to see is one of the most amazing overland journeys ever made. Marco Polo left Venice in 1271, traveling through Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan before he finally arrived here about 3 years later, the Pamir Mountains between China and Afghanistan. I'm sure that this would have been one of the more arduous legs of Marco's journey. He probably traveled here in winter because in his book he had written that in the mountains, flying birds there are none. In that case, Marco would have had to deal with blizzards and avalanches, and as if that weren't bad enough, he claimed that up here there was neither habitation nor shelter.
'Tis said to be the highest place in the world. And when you have got to this height, you find a great lake between two mountains, and out of it a fine river running through a plain clothed with the finest pasture in the world.
Cool breeze, soft sunlight, and unbelievable scenery. Just doesn't get any better than this.
As Marco made his way through China, he encountered on more than a few occasions a rather unusual custom, and I imagine it would have made his eyes pop, especially since he was still only a teenager.
Now, I don't know if this is the village or not, but one thing I've been noticing is how good looking these women really are. Now, these are Kyrgyz people, right?
Yes, they are.
This is so beautiful here, and there's only these two families.
That's true, yeah.
And I imagine that this work they're doing here is making these same carpets that they're sitting on over here?
Yes, it's their job.
Okay. At least half a dozen places throughout the book. He talks about meeting some tribe where when the visitor arrives, the husband allows the visitor to do what he may with the wife as well as the daughter. How old is she?
She's 16.
What's her name?
Miken.
Tell her she's very pretty.
If a foreigner comes to the house of one of these people to lodge, the host is delighted and desires his wife to put herself entirely at the guest's disposal. Obviously, the country is a fine one to visit for a lad from 16 to 24.
Now, Chinese scholars have actually confirmed that the practice of sharing wives and daughters with foreign visitors was indeed an ancient tradition in remote areas. The theory being that it helped widen the gene pool, avoiding the threat of marriages between blood relations. Well, these women were really nice, but they weren't nearly as hospitable, shall I say, as the ones I'm looking for. So I guess we'll move on and try to find another curiosity Marco says he found in these parts.
So Abdul, what I'm really looking for here is a traditional family, and I need you to ask them if they've ever seen the fabled ovis poli, you know, the huge Marco Polo sheep with curly horns.
There are great quantities of wild sheep of huge size. Their horns are as much as 6 palms in length.
It's as we like.
Okay. Can you ask Emmett Big about one thing? Yeah, Marco Polo was here and he talked about the big sheep, big horned sheep that were in the Pamir Mountains. Has he ever seen one?
Marco Polo bir qo'yni ko'rib ketgan. Ashu Pamir qo'y ekan bu. Negiz shunday yo'g'il kelgan deb cho'ngga qo'y. Shuni ko'rib baqqanmi dedi ashuna qo'yni. Cho'ng qo'yni. Ko'rganmi? Yes, he saw.
How big is that sheep?
Qancha cho'nglikda qo'y? Just like donkey.
Just like a donkey, okay. Well, I never saw one live, but I did find this set of horns on the other side of the Pamirs in Afghanistan. Just like a donkey. Marco certainly didn't exaggerate on this one. Thank her very much for thanking them all for their hospitality. Rahmat. Thank you very much. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Well, it's still another 250 miles to the great medieval town of Kashgar. It takes about 9 hours by bus. But in Marco's day, he said crossing these mountains and gorges took about 2.5 months.
Now, Marco Polo is supposed to have travelled from Venice all the way to Peking and then throughout the rest of China. We assume, and I think most readers assume, that it's a travel book where you can follow his route from place to place. But if you read it closely, you can't possibly do that. He suddenly shoots up to the north to Siberia, then cuts back down again. He reprises, goes back on his footsteps. So whatever it is, it's not an itinerary that you can follow directly.
Some of the distances that he describes. Sometimes he's right on, incredibly accurate, and other times he's way off. But the miracle for me is to think what he wrote about was 20 years after he actually made the trip.
There are a good number of towns and villages, but the greatest and finest is Kashgar itself.
Well, Kashgar is arguably the biggest market in Asia, and it was a big market, obviously, in Marco Polo's day. As he puts it, there's a wealth of goods here, and merchants travel from Kashgar all over the world. The feel of this place is definitely, for me, 13th century. What hasn't changed are the people and the faces and the bargaining and all this human interaction, and that's what turns me on. And those are the pictures that I'm going for. This, the donkey section, it seems to be contain the most characters. I think it's because donkeys are like a very basic form of transportation, and therefore you get very basic people here. Great faces. seemingly much more than any other part of the market. And the great thing about shooting here is nobody seems to pay any attention to you while you're shooting because they're all so intent on the work at hand, which is buying and selling their donkeys. So I'm able to walk around here and shoot without anybody really caring that this camera's in their face. I did a picture like this in Afghanistan, same thing, throwing the weed up. And I always choose an angle where I'm right in the middle of the action. So I almost want to be right in the scene so you can feel the wind and feel that dust in your face. It hides and reveals at the same time. Marco talks about wheat, perfect illustration, plus, as you know, my job is to make whatever picture of an ordinary situation look a lot more than ordinary. I love that. About old Kashgar is this feeling that things haven't changed much here in the last 1,000 years or so. I like sitting on a corner and watching the world go by. The women with the veils over their head, these donkey carts coming by. I feel privileged being a photographer and being able to see scenes like this and record them because I feel like I'm seeing history and putting it on film, seeing something that won't be here in another 3 or 4 years.
As we travel east a few hours across this desert, we're going to come across Yamashita, a town famous for its knives.
Well, Marco talks about steel making on the Silk Road, usually in reference to making weapons of war. But anyway, we thought we should come here because this is the first and only steel making we found. Of course, it's also the best knives supposedly on the Silk Road. And surely Marco passed this way, and everybody, as you can see, all these Uyghurs carry one, and I'm sure he was carrying one too. I understand the Yangasar knife is the best knife on the Silk Road. Is that true?
Yes.
How long have they been making them?
For a long time.
Like how long?
Maybe the history for about 1,000 years.
1,000 years?
Yes.
How long does it take to make one of these knives?
One knife. It takes 3 days to put up one knife. Yeah.
How long have these guys been working here? How long does it take for them to be a master knife maker?
For my master, maybe over 30 years. Yeah.
How long has this guy been working?
Maybe about 40 years or 45 years.
This guy's been
Yes.
working here for 45 years? Wow.
He is one of the oldest knife masters in this factory.
Uh-huh. Thanks a lot, Osmond, for the tour.
It's all right.
Let's get out of this noise. Show me some of those
Okay.
knives I'd like to
Okay.
buy. Hey, check out my Yangasar blade with the yak horn handle.
So from Yangasar, Marco continues along the famous Silk Road. And one of the most important commodities around here, of course, is silk, which gave the road its name.
Now, most silk exported from China today is made in factories, but of course we wanted to find silk being made the traditional way, the way it would have been produced during Marco's time. We found what we were looking for in the villages around Hotan. Really, what's going on here?
This is called silk boiling. So they boil the cocoon in this pot about 15 minutes, and then it becomes very soft. So the lady find the head of the thread, do the silk reeling. From one cocoon, they can get about 800 meters of the
800 meters.
of raw silk.
Wow. What happens to the worms? Are people still eating those worms?
Yes, people still eat the worms, also make the soy sauce, also make soap.
Do you like the taste?
Yeah.
I'm not fond of it myself. I've never seen that before in my life. Are you watching this? Guli, can you explain to me what's going on here? Can you explain to me what she's doing with this?
This is a cornstarch. Make the silk stiff.
It makes it stiff.
Yes, stiff.
Wow. I've never seen that. That was great. I guess what I find incredible is, first of all, the fruit here is so good. Marco Polo talks about it. He raves about the fruit. And we just have traveled through nothing but desert. And here we are in an oasis town. You just happen to put some water on the ground, and it turns into clay so that these guys can build this wall. And it's the same soil that grows this amazing fruit. It's almost like, if you look at that, it looks like just plain sand, but put some water on it and it becomes just the most fertile soil that you can imagine. I'm now going in search of what Marco Polo called the cloth that doesn't burn. And it comes from these remarkable rocks which can produce fiber as soft as cotton. Not only that, this material is fireproof. Here it is, just like the book says. It's sort of a fibrous, feels like cotton. Chinese call it cotton rock. And this is where it comes from. These veins right here, this white stuff is stuck in these veins here, sort of a greenish color in this rock. And that's where asbestos comes from. But in Marco's time, many believe that asbestos actually came from the shedding skin of a salamander, a lizard-like creature that was said to live in the fire. It was Marco who first revealed to the West the secret of its origins.
It is not true that those cloths are of the hair of an animal which lives in fire. It is a vein of the earth.
Today, asbestos is big business here in China. It's used to make all sorts of insulating material. China has some of the biggest asbestos mines in the world today, and they're still obviously finding a lot of uses for this stuff. I guess everybody's wearing a mask because they do realize there's a danger here. But just as Marco describes it, so it is here. He passed through here. It has to be first-hand observation. He can't have described it anywhere better unless he had seen it, just the way I'm looking at it right now.
With each triumphant find, I am more and more convinced that Marco had to be writing from first-hand experience. Not only are the sites exactly as he described, but we're finding each precisely where he tells us to look. No matter if you're a believer in Marco Polo or not, the mystery of whether he made it to China has brought us here. He's crossed the Pamirs, the so-called roof of the world, suffering from incredible cold and high altitude. He's descended into Kashgar, where he visits the great market and reports about all the merchants who from here go all over the world. He's seen the silk being made on the Silk Road, and he's discovered the amazing cloth that doesn't burn. And here we are, now on the edge of the Taklamakan, heading to the fabled land of Xanadu and the magnificent palace of the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan. And perhaps his biggest challenge lies ahead of him, crossing this unending, unbearable desert, which in its native language means, go in and you won't come out.
When travelers are on the move by night, and one of them chances to lag behind, he will hear spirits talking, and will suppose them to be his comrades, and thus shall a traveler be led astray, so that he never finds his party, and in this way many have perished.
Well, here I am in the Taklamakan, the hottest and driest desert in all of China.
Gives you a real appreciation for what Marco Polo must have gone through, spending 2 months crossing over this same wasteland of sand. 100-degree heat, you're always feeling dry, you're never quite comfortable. It's the sand that's itching or the sweat that's dripping down your brow. It must have been the hardest part of his journey.
From very early on, people cast doubt on Marco Polo. First of all, people didn't believe what was written, how vast and enormous China was. Then you get more in the 19th century, people start questioning whether it was possible to get from X to Y in the sort of time he states. And gradually, I think, if you were to build up the doubts that have been expressed over the centuries, you start to see that there are very real questions about Marco Polo, but they never quite defeat those who want him to have been there.
So here we are now in Oxay, on the edge of the desert, and we've run into these nomadic people, or former nomads. They're Kazakhs, and would you believe it, it's a wedding. As I often say, photographers are paid to be lucky.
Okay, so this is the bride being brought to the groom's neighborhood, and she just got off the car. She doesn't have her full getup on, but boy, does she look great wearing red. Can't believe it. The groom's coming in to meet the family. Everybody's welcoming him. Look at all the guests. Look at these babes. Look at these women wearing these incredibly colorful dresses. This must be the bride's mother. Dance. They don't even need music to dance here. All right. I don't know what rhythm these ladies are dancing to, but I don't hear any music.
Өрісі түкті болсын, қонысы құтты болсын, дастарханы берекелі болсын, жастардың жүрген жері мерекелі болсын. Абырой асып тұрсын, дәулет тасып тұрсын, достар тошып тұрсын, дұшман шошып тұрсын.
Those who have reared the sheep bring it with their children and perform a solemn act of devotion. They will have the sheep slaughtered and cooked. They have the head, feet, entrails, and fleece.
Taudumsun tansanıp çıkan adam, can yerdinden ayrılıp savgarday. Hatırımın altayın, hem tartayın, sağındırga sarıfa, barsam sağan aysayın, barsam sağan aysayın. Aslıklı kara tau, aslıklı ala tau, jasın jelin jeti su, yuva jerin tamaşa,
In rereading my copy of Marco Polo last night regarding his time spent in Dunhuang, I was struck by the similarity, or not even similarity, how exactly he described a sheep sacrifice, in this case for the protection of the children, and how that just exactly fit what we saw here at the wedding last night.
Of course, his critics say it's not what Marco described that raises doubts, it's what he failed to mention.
There are some very serious omissions which do really seriously make one question whether this is an eyewitness account. He doesn't, for example, in China, mention chopsticks once. He doesn't mention drinking tea, although his defenders would say, well, that's because he didn't like tea. Perhaps he preferred wine because he was Italian. He doesn't mention the bound feet that he might have seen on certain Chinese women. So these omissions are a slight problem, I think.
I think it's important to show not only what Marco described, but what he didn't describe, and try to come to some answer as to why he didn't describe it. I'm looking for the famous village with the women with the bound feet. Now, bound feet women don't exist everywhere in China because it was banned about 100 years ago. But in these far-off provinces and faraway villages, there still exist quite a few of these women who are now in their 80s and 90s. This particular village is famous because they formed a troupe called the Little Feet Dancing Troupe, so I know they're here. Now, one of the biggest arguments by those non-believers in Marco Polo is this bound foot issue. However, I think he did talk about it. He describes the women's gait as being very dainty, and that each step is only a hair's breadth in front of the next step. That, to me, is describing the way a bound-foot woman walks. The other thing is, he would not have seen them since they all wore long dresses in those days. And therefore, in my opinion, for sure, he talks about the bound feet without ever having seen them.
These women have the smallest feet I've ever seen.
Okay, so May, I understand these women have the smallest feet in the village?
Yeah.
Can you ask how old was she when they bound her feet?
奶奶几岁开始割？就很小很小的时候就开始割了。
我小姑娘就割了。
哦，几岁呢？哈，大概。
小姑娘4、5岁我都是嫁过了嘛。
4 and 5 years old.
4 and 5.
Yeah.
而且不过就那时候叫上了去。现在上了嘛，北京上了慢慢嘛，天子可能换个带了去。没得会个个打过去。
So at that time, the women they have to have a very smaller
Yes.
very small kids,
Right.
so that they can marry a very good person
Uh-huh.
and a rich person.
Could I take a look at that shoe?
可以给他看看，我给他看看个。
那边村住了。
And who makes
哎，
these
是哪
shoes?
是你？
是
也可以
这个
说
鞋子是哪个做
做
的？
七宝树，戴了眼镜，
哎
戴了眼。
，she wear eyeglasses and made this.
Oh,
And
so she
this
made
is she,
them herself.
yeah.
Wow.
Invite other people to do for her.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Here.
Do you mind if I see how the size compared to? Unbelievable. But what really is amazing to me is they've been able to have a pretty darn normal life. And obviously there's no shame to this. They seem to be very proud of their feet. It's just an amazing practice. Now, I'm not a scholar, so I decided to talk to Professor Liu, a historian and specialist in Marco Polo. Professor Liu, we're in a tea house, drinking some very good Chinese tea, and I'm going to ask you, therefore, what about the omissions of Marco Polo, the fact that he never mentioned tea or chopsticks, for example?
In the Mongolian period, the Mongols was on the top, the ruling class, and all the foreigners, like Marco Polo, belong to the second class, and the northern Chinese and the southern Chinese were the third and the fourth class. So it is not strange that many of the people like Marco Polo always stay with the people belonging to the same class.
So he wouldn't have met many Chinese.
Yes.
As Marco rarely interacted with the lowly Chinese, no wonder he didn't pick up many of their customs. But still, how do you explain Marco's most glaring omission, his failure to mention China's greatest landmark, the Great Wall? The Great Wall of China, over 2,000 years old, over 4,000 miles long. It's been built and rebuilt by countless ruling dynasties. How come Marco Polo never mentions it in his book? It's here in Jiayuguan that the mystery of Marco Polo starts to fall apart. As any China scholar can tell you, it was this wall, this 10-foot high maybe mud wall, that Marco Polo saw when he traveled through here in 1275. Now this wall is the Han Wall, built somewhere around 8200, just pretty much a lump wandering through the desert. And if I was Marco Polo, I wouldn't have paid it a second glance, especially after the walls that he saw and commented on in places like Bam in Iran, the world's biggest citadel. The Great Wall in his day was just not great. It's the Ming Wall that all the tourists go to in Beijing that gives the great to the Great Wall, and that was built 300 years after Marco came this way. This is it, end of the Great Wall. No way to go this way, no way to go that way either with the mountains. Marco Polo had to have passed through here as everybody did coming into China from the west. By now, the Polos had traveled perhaps 1,300 miles in China, about halfway to Chengdu, and I was getting a little hungry. So the real question for me is, did Marco Polo bring spaghetti and ravioli from Italy to China
Or did he bring noodles and jiaozi from China to Italy? And the real answer is the Arabs brought noodles both to China and Italy well before Marco Polo ever arrived here. But for me, I don't care either way. I just like the taste of noodles. Pasta or Chinese noodles, either way, one of my favorite foods. As we approach Inner Mongolia, I'm hoping to see the famous Mongolian horses that so impressed Marco and helped the Mongols create the biggest empire the world has ever known. Must have been an amazing sight to see hundreds of thousands of these horses and men going over these hills. They went off to battle. They didn't have to carry oats or grain to feed the horses because the horses just lived off the land. And they, of course, lived off the horses. You know, I need to be a little closer. Let's go this way. They'd be on a forced march and going hungry for a couple of days. They'd actually slit the horse's vein and drink the blood as it splurted out, and then sew it up, and on they went. And you can imagine how an army of that toughness and mobility on horses could really cover ground over this flat land. We're getting close to Xanadu, and Marco Polo must have been in great anticipation. Kublai Khan was, and I quote, the most powerful man in people and in lands and in treasure that was ever in the world. This is where the great Khan reigned 3 months of the year. All that is left now is rubble. Hey, we finally made it. Here we are at Shandu, or Xanadu as Coleridge called it. Marco Polo's destination. This is what he came to see. This is where he came to meet the Khan. And boy, he must have been impressed. Figure this guy's been traveling for 3.5 years. It only took us, what, a little over 3 weeks? He gets here after crossing hundreds of miles of desert, and he sees this green and these walls. You can imagine what it must have been like. I'm standing on the gate here, on the outside wall. It's the southern gate, as you can see. The sun is down this way, directly west. This city's been laid out on a grid. You can see the outer wall coming down this way, going down that way to the east, and coming around pretty well defined all the way out there. Yeah, Marco talks about these, what I think is a roof tile and the shine it gives off 700 years ago, and you can still find them sitting on the ground here in the middle of Xanadu. When I read Marco Polo's description of the palace, I'm seeing the Forbidden City in my mind's eye. The checkerboard pattern, the north-south axis, the way it's laid out, the double walls, the huge halls that could seat 6,000 banqueters at one sitting. What he describes is what I feel here, and what I'm seeing is indeed this Forbidden City, but The actual palace was destroyed, as were most remnants of the Yuan dynasty. Wow, can you believe this? I've been here at least a half a dozen times, and every time I come here, I'm just totally blown away by the scale and grandeur. I feel like I'm on a movie set. And just think what Marco Polo must have felt. A small town guy, and he comes to this amazing city with over 1 million population. He must have been totally blown away. Just must have absolutely floored him to see something like this.
From Xanadu, Marco traveled to Daidu, the new city being built by the Khan. Today it's called Beijing, and you can still find Marco's legacy in China's bustling capital.
There is not a bridge in the world to compare with it. It has 24 arches and is built entirely of grey marble. At the foot of the column is a marble lion, and on top of the column another of great beauty and size and fine workmanship.
You know, Marco Polo was totally impressed by this bridge, and he described it in a lot of detail, and therefore, to this day, his name's on it. This is the Marco Polo Bridge. But, you know, I've been here photographing this thing for half a day now, and I still couldn't have told you how many arches are here unless I specifically focused on that and counted them. So those who doubt Marco Polo are saying that he didn't get the arches right. And I'm saying, who's counting? He also talked about the lions up there on the columns, and he got the lion on top right, but he also mentioned there was a lion on the bottom. So again, the doubters say, well, look, he mentioned 2 lions and there's only 1. But for a guy who supposedly wrote the book without taking notes, I say it's an amazing feat that he got as much right as he did on some detail like a column and how many lions were carved either top or bottom.
It was here that Marco became a trusted confidant of the Khan, working as an emissary and traveling to the furthest reaches of the Mongol Empire. Marco could not have imagined what the next 17 years would bring. The vast cities and strange customs he's going to see. People who dine on raw flesh. Chinese cities far more advanced than those of the West. Could any of this be true?
We have to make sure that what we are photographing is accurate. Who, what, when, where, why are the main questions when I'm writing up my notes. And at the end of every morning or every session of pictures, I like to sit down, log in my film, and write as much detail as I can about the subject that I just photographed. Somehow I think Marco Polo, in many of the sections in the book, has had to have written from notes. The reason is he's just too detailed and too accurate. There are other sections that you can tell he's just sort of is writing from memory because there's no detail there. I don't know about you, but for me, it's very hard to remember what I shot yesterday, or did yesterday, let alone 3 weeks or 3 years ago. In Marco's case, some of the stuff he's writing about is 30 years old before he gets around to writing about it. So either he has had an amazing memory or he took notes. Perhaps that was when he was working as an envoy for the Khan, traveling on his behalf. He took notes in order to better explain what he was seeing in some of these far-flung provinces. This is the Grand Canal of Hangzhou, a man-made waterway Marco described as stretching nearly 1,100 miles from Beijing.
So that this Hangzhou is, you see, a city of great importance, and Messer Marco Polo himself, of whom this book speaks, did govern this city for full years by the order of the Great Khan.
Well, we're in Hangzhou, where Marco supposedly lived for 3 years, and supposedly he was the governor here. Now, most experts figure that he couldn't have been governor, otherwise there would have been some mention of him in Chinese texts about the period.
I think one of the most serious problems about Marco Polo is the fact that he doesn't appear in any of the Chinese or indeed the Mongol records of the periods. The Chinese were the biggest bureaucrats in the world. They wrote everything down. They recorded everything, every governor of every city, every small official. Marco Polo and his family do not appear anywhere. There are records of other Europeans listed in the Chinese annals, but nothing about the Polos. And believe me, Chinese historians, European historians have been searching for the last couple of hundred years, and we've found nothing. That's a very serious problem.
From my point of view as a historian, you cannot expect to find any even important persons to be mentioned by the Chinese sources of the Mongol-Yuan period, because the original archive of the Yuan was destroyed at the end of the Yuan period.
The belief is that he was actually a lower-ranking public servant, perhaps a salt administrator. And the reason why they think that is because he knows a lot about salt. And Hangzhou was where all the salt in China was coming from at the time. It was very close to the sea. And anyway, where we are now is actually in a salt administrator's house, which are pretty nice digs. It is a little strange that if he indeed did live here for 3 years, he certainly had very little to say about it. It was almost as if he was saving all his praise for the next town we're going to, which is Hangzhou, which he described as the greatest city in the world.
This city is beyond dispute the finest and noblest in the world.
To me, Hangzhou is a no-brainer. It was the greatest city in the world. He called it the city of heaven. And it was the London, the Paris, the Rome, the Beijing of its day. So, of course, a young guy is going to be interested in hanging out here and in describing it in great detail. You know, if you substitute the word market for great shopping. If you talk about, he talks about food, well, think restaurants. He talks about the elegant ladies and the wine. Substitute that for like nightlife, and realizing the guy's in his like 20s, he was just having a great time here. When Marco described this, it was pretty much the first time anybody ever described aquaculture, and that was 700 years ago. They raise the fish here in the lake, and then take them on a regular basis. And he thought it was amazing that people had a full-time living as fishermen. So I guess fishermen in Venice would only go out on occasion or something. And for him, it was a big deal that these guys made a living just fishing. It's not hard to understand why Venetians couldn't believe what Marco Polo was telling them. The numbers alone of 1.6 million houses here, 12,000 bridges, partiers, thousands going to weddings on the island, pleasure seekers. In medieval Venice, a city of maybe 100,000 people, there was no time for leisure. And here on the other side of the world was this incredible city, so far superior to anything in the West. People here had just so much better a life.
While working on behalf of the Great Khan, Marco Polo traveled to the remotest parts of the empire, encountering many strange people, but none that he relished more than those of the land they call Tibet.
Men of extraordinary abstinence. All their life long, they eat nothing but bran, which they take mixed with hot water. That is their food. Bran, and nothing but bran.
I'm in a Tibetan village above Labrang Monastery, and I'm sitting down with a bunch of young lamas about to have breakfast. What we're looking at here is some yak butter tea. That's the yak butter. Big chunk of it into my smoky tea. And this is the staple of the Tibetan diet. Not bad. Kind of like rancid milk on top of smoky tea. Okay, and so he's putting in some tsampa, which is bran. Marco Polo describes this. He describes the lamas as eating nothing but this bran. Okay, well, why don't you guys make me one? I don't think I've got quite the skill. Marco also talks about how dirty the Tibetans are. And the fact that they only wash maybe once a year. However, they definitely have to use their hands to make this tsamba. Well, I think that's enough for that.
They have immense minsters and abbeys, some of them as big as a small town, with more than 2,000 monks in a single abbey. These monks have the head and beard shaven.
Monks, head shaven, beard shaven, eating tsampa and worshiping their gods. It's as like nothing has changed here in the 700 years. I come here, I feel like I'm seeing exactly what Marco saw. Well, this is why Marco was called, or so-called, Milione. People couldn't believe his figures because there were always tens of thousands, and the cities, the populations, the number of boats, the number of bridges, they were always so much bigger than any numbers that existed in Europe at the time. Who ever heard of a church in Europe with 2,000 monks praying at one time? Sometimes Marco's describing things obviously from first hand. This is one of them. He had to have known these people and been here to so enthusiastically describe them. There are other places along the route where he's talking about cities that he passes by with 2 or 3 sentences. But a place like this, he obviously has been here because you can just read the enthusiasm in his words as he talks about the place.
I think there's no question that he could have written the book without going to China. Only 100 years later, there was a famous merchant called Pegalotti who worked in Antwerp and never went further than the Holy Land. And he wrote quite a famous book on how to trade with China. He even advised things like taking a woman with you because it wasn't safe to consort with Chinese ladies. My feeling is that we're not dealing with an eyewitness account here. I don't think that Marco Polo went, saw and described.
Certainly, some of the things Marco described does confound the imagination. He claimed he saw people who dined on raw flesh. This I had to see for myself. On behalf of the great Mongol leader Kublai Khan, Marco Polo traveled to Yunnan in southern China, encountering many minority tribes.
One thing that astounded him was the fact that the people here ate their meat raw. And obviously they still do, but I was surprised to find that the animal they love eating raw happens to be pork, which is such a no-no. I've learned from childhood that pork always has to be well cooked, and here these people for 700 years have been eating raw pork, and as you can see by the healthy faces around here, they don't look much the worse for it. But as you can see, the kids are used to it. It's a common scene out here. If you want to eat your pig raw, you got to get it fresh. That's about. I love the way everybody participates. You got all the kids in here as well, looking forward to the feast afterwards. So now they need to burn this pig just to singe the hair and to sort of sterilize the skin. Okay, now we got all the women involved in this part. It's interesting to see the roles. Obviously the men have control the fire. These guys look like regular surgeons.
People of that country eat their meat raw and put in a sauce of garlic and spices, and so eat it just as we eat meat that is dressed.
Not bad. How come you guys aren't eating? Try something. These women are kind of beefy, you know. I think, I shouldn't say beefy, wrong word. They look like they're well fed, and I assume they must eat quite a big diet of pork here. I always say that I can pretty much eat whatever anybody else is eating anywhere in the world, and I trust that those healthy faces tell me that that meat is perfectly safe, so I'm not worried about it. And anyway, it was an experience. I don't think I'd make it a regular part of my menu, but in the interests of Marco Polo, I knew that I had to eat it.
But there are some whoppers in the book which are pretty unbelievable.
There's all sorts of medieval rubbish, fable, mixed in with what is generally now treated as a rather serious geographic text, and it makes it quite difficult to take the serious bits seriously.
And I assure you, all the men of this island have heads like dogs, and teeth and eyes likewise. In fact, in the face, they are all just like big mastiff dogs.
But in China, there are some pretty unusual practices that do really exist.
All right, well, we're out here cormorant fishing, mainly because Marco Polo never talked about cormorants. So we think that's a good enough reason to be out here photographing this unusual way of fishing and wonder why Marco didn't talk about it, considering it must surprise anybody. Certainly has me surprised. But this is one thing that's hard to explain. They were fishing back 700 years ago like this. He probably did see it if he was here, but neglected to mention it. Then again, you can't mention everything. Maybe he just forgot. And then again, at the end of, on his deathbed, he did say, I've only told you half of what I've seen, so this must be one of the things that he hasn't told us. Maybe he was thinking there would be another chapter sometime. Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh, you see the size of that fish? Wow. After so many years in China, the Polos must have been feeling homesick. Marco, only 17 when he set out from Venice, was now 37. He knew that Kublai Khan's health was failing and his regime was losing its grip on power. We're in Zhouzhuang, Venice to the east. My favorite time of the day, sunrise. The colors are warm, the light is soft, and everybody's waking up and doing what they do in the morning. We like to call it magic hour because good things happen with the light. And this particular town really fits Marco's description of Suzhou. He talked about the 2,000 bridges and canals all over the city of Suzhou. And here we have at least 100 still left. So this is my image of the way Suzhou looked back 700 years ago. And you can see how he must have felt right at home, and maybe that's the reason why he spent so much time in this area. It just felt like home. Finally, in 1291, the Khan allowed the Polos to leave. They traveled by sea from southern China via India to the Persian Gulf and back overland to Venice. Perhaps there were epidemics, typhoons, or shipwrecks, for only 18 of the 600 passengers of their expedition survived. But Marco arrived in Venice a rich man, or so they say. Well, a lot of stories about how Marco came back into Venice. The one I like the best is he comes in looking like a beggar, and he is wearing this ratty old coat. He whips off the coat and pulls out the lining, and inside, the lining is lined with all kinds of gems and precious stones, and everybody then knows it's Marco Polo, and he's about to tell his stories to the world.
The great problem with Marco Polo and his travels or his discovery of the world is that we don't have the original manuscript. This has disappeared completely. What we have are a number of manuscripts which were copied from copies from copies from copies. There are maybe 150 early manuscripts of the text of Marco Polo, and every single one of them is different. Now, if you don't have the original manuscript, it's very difficult to track back to the source. Where do the stories come from?
Well, there's one thing that a lot of people don't know. For years, Venice had been fighting a sea war with its rival Genoa, and shortly after his return, Marco was put under house arrest. The world's greatest traveler actually wrote the book from the four walls of a prison cell. It was under these circumstances that this legendary book was written, dictated to his cellmate Rustichello, a famous writer known for his romantic embellishments. So perhaps it was this ghost writer, Rustichello, who was responsible for some of the exaggerations.
I think in the end, we've got to try and make a balance between the queries, the problems, the omissions, the doubts, and the question of whether he went to China or not. And for me, it's fairly clear he didn't, but many other people feel very strongly that he did. I think in the end, we can't prove anything with fingerprints or DNA by now. 700 years have passed, and in the end, it's really just a question of faith.
You know, for every argument the naysayers have about Marco, I've got an answer. And I'm the only one that's done this trip. It's one thing reading about it and figuring out where he went from a library seat back in London, but when you're out on the road, you can't help but be a big believer in Marco Polo. He's too right on.
I believe it was God's will that we should get back in order that people might learn about the things that the world contains. Never was there a man who ever traveled over so much of the world as did that noble and illustrious citizen of the city of Venice, Messer Marco Polo. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen.